Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Skeptic Bible Study. I've received a request from a number of viewers lately to do a review of the first part of Zeitgeist. And I think a good place to begin is to say that I come at the Jesus myth from a completely different angle. Well, first of all, I think the whole Jesus myther is kind of a funny term. We don't have a word for a Hercules myther or a Xenu myther. I prefer the title skeptic myself. But anyway, I come at the Jesus myth from a completely different angle than Zeitgeist does. The first part of Zeitgeist talks about the alleged similarities between the various pagan savior sun gods and the Jesus myth. Personally, I come at it from the standpoint of listening to what the Christians have had to say. I've read the Bible. I've seen all the contradictions in the story. I've also seen the way that the story itself contradicts what we know about history of the time. I've been unable to construct any kind of a coherent timeline as to exactly when was Jesus supposed to have been born again, when was his ministry, and so forth. Reconciling that with what we know about history is a serious problem. You need a really big shoehorn in order to do that. I have read various Christian apologists and have studied them closely and have read all of their feeble excuses and their logical fallacies. And I've just come to the conclusion that the Christians have never even created a coherent, believable story, never mind one that I should necessarily take seriously as part of the historical time stream. I mean, why should I take this any more seriously than I take this? Or why should I believe that Hercules is a historical character any more than I believe that Jesus is a historical character, or vice versa? So, because the Christians have never constructed anything like an actual case, by the time Acharya S. comes onto the scene, as far as I'm concerned, all she's doing is just bouncing around the rubble. And so, I really have not studied pagan mythology closely enough to confirm or deny whether or not Jesus was identical to Horus. As far as I'm concerned, he might or might not have been. The question is, did Jesus ever actually walk the earth? And is there any reason to take these myths of the Christians any more seriously than any other myths that we've seen? And the only shards of evidence that I've seen the Christians offer are, most of them are late, all of them are late, most of them are 2nd century or later, and all of them have problems of some kind or other. One of them in particular, Josephus, is an admitted forgery. And I talk about the problems of the constructing Jesus timelines and putting Jesus into history and why there are all these problems. And I'm going to go ahead and post some links to the side where I have some videos that talk about that extensively. The point is, the Christians have never presented a believable case. So, as far as whether or not Jesus was in fact a carbon copy of Horus, I personally don't know that he was. I take a more cautious approach in my own book, God versus the Bible, and I say that there were some elements that were similar. Now, I don't know that he was a carbon copy, but you can see how the Christians might have been inspired by earlier stories told by the pagans. For example, or by the Jews for that matter. For example, in the Gospel of Matthew, it says that Jesus survived a tyrant's infanticidal rampage, and that seemed to come straight from the book of Exodus. Matthew was the most Jewish of the Gospels, and so it makes sense that the author of Matthew felt the need to basically draw some parallels between Jesus and Moses, or might have been inspired by Jewish myths, say, more than pagan myths. There are other elements that are clearly borrowed from in Christianity. For example, the whole concept of hell and salvation. The Jews had no concept of hell, and I talk about that in the history of hell, and I've got a link to that on the side. Whereas that was a concept that was borrowed from pagan ideas, and in particular Zoroaster was the one that was preaching about heaven and hell and salvation. They may have gotten it from that. They may have gotten it from a few other sources as well. I also talk about the Valley of Gehenna and how that was a possible source of inspiration. So it's clear that there were some similarities, some elements, and it's possible that Jesus was a composite character. But even if he wasn't, all that would prove is that he's original, not that he isn't a fabrication. But I tell you, what really is suspicious is what the early Christians themselves had to say about Jesus, and the various critics who said what you say about Jesus is similar to what we've been saying all along about Dionysus or Horus or Zoroaster or Mithra or any others. Justin Martyr, a Christian who lived at the very beginning of the 2nd century, once wrote, "Having heard it proclaimed through the prophets that the Christ was to come and that the ungodly men were to be punished by fire, the wicked spirits put forward many to be called sons of gods, under the impression that they would be able to produce in men the idea that the things that were said with regard to Christ were merely marvelous tales like the things that were said by the poets." So in other words, Justin is kind of frustrated here, and he's talking about how the devil did it. The devil copied Jesus in advance and promoted all these other fanciful stories so that the pagans would be confused into thinking that Jesus was another myth just like all of the others. So the question I have for the Christian apologists who hotly deny that Jesus had any similarity to any of these other pagan savior gods and that he was a completely original character, why didn't Justin Martyr simply say so? The easier thing for Justin Martyr to have done would have just simply been said, well, of course Jesus is completely different. Look, and then point out how he was different. As opposed to saying the devil copied it in advance. Why would he do that unless he really had no other option? Anyway, just some food for thought, and as always, may God's gift of reason light our way.